Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Nason, Senior Director of Communications at MassBio, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to MassBio's Professional Development Forum on Building Medical Affairs Teams of the Future. We want this to be an interactive discussion, so please ask questions throughout and we'll get to as many as we can. You can either use the chat function to the right of the video if you want to log into YouTube, or you can also ask questions anonymously through the comment section below the video. I also want to thank MassBio's Marketing, Communications, and Commercialization Forum Working Group for making this event possible, especially co-chair Marie Sancherico, Director of Health Economics and Outcomes Research at Takeda, who will moderate today's panel. But before we get to that, I'd like to introduce Ann Westra, Senior Knowledge Expert with McKinsey, who will provide an overview of how medical affairs has evolved over time and where we are today. Ann, thank you so much. I'm going to pass it off to you.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. As mentioned, I'm an expert on medical topics in the pharma industry at McKinsey, and I lead our work at Medical Affairs, including both our serving medical affairs clients across the industry, but also our cross-industry initiatives. And much of what I'm going to share today comes from these discussions that we've had with medical affairs leaders about what the future could look like. We've run a leaders forum over the last 13 or 14 years that brings together medical affairs leaders from predominantly the pharma industry, but we've tapped their knowledge and views to produce regular compendiums and white papers about medical affairs, including recently a piece of work on the Vision for Medical Affairs 2025. And these insights are supported by benchmarking and other data pieces that we do to really understand what's going on across the industry. Before I dive into it, I wanted to just ground us all on a definition of medical affairs and what are the activities that are in the function. We tend to think of it as three things. So there's the evidence generation and the evidence dissemination out to customers, and then the medical strategy that makes the decisions on where you focus on both of those activities. Medical strategy tends to be the asset level leadership across the life cycle for each asset, focusing on collaborating with partners across the organization and development, commercial and elsewhere, to ensure the success of that asset and ultimately to ensure that the asset provides benefits to patients, including improving outcomes and improving their experience with their disease. Evidence generation in medical affairs typically starts post-launch with post-launch clinical trials run by the company, health economics and outcomes research, and IITs. But increasingly, medical affairs organizations are also getting involved earlier in launch and helping shape development activities and other pre-launch evidence generation to ensure that the evidence package that is ready at launch meets the needs of patients and other customers. And then lastly, medical affairs is involved in disseminating that information to customers through their field teams, typically called medical science liaisons, that are meeting directly with physicians and other healthcare providers. They also typically have call centers, websites under medical information services to allow other HCPs to access that information. They write publications and other pieces of material to communicate the evidence and data about the assets externally. And they support medical education, including continuing medical education of healthcare providers. There's these trends probably will not surprise any of you, but there's a lot of trends impacting medical affairs today. It's increasingly during the COVID time, digital and innovation around care delivery and other methods is of course a huge driving force. The cost constraints and the increased role of the patient is also pushing much more of the information and the evidence that medical affairs is experts at across a broader network of customers, and so increasing the role of medical affairs as well. Medical affairs leaders are starting to stand up behind a new strategic role for themselves. It's truly becoming the third pillar of the organization as an equal partner with both research and development and commercial and other functions. And doing this will require medical affairs to really adopt a new vision. And this is the vision that was in our white paper, and I'll talk through it in a little bit more detail over the next couple of pages. The goal here is to really organize all that medical affairs does around optimizing patient experiences and outcomes, to communicate how what medical affairs does shapes outcomes, but also where possible to have the data to measure the impact of medical affairs activities against those outcomes. And this will happen across 4 key pieces: innovating evidence generation, accelerating access, transforming and personalizing medical engagement, and then the last bucket, stepping up medical leadership, doing all the activities internally to make sure that the other 3 are really high quality and provide value. And I'll talk through each of them a little bit more. So evidence generation, as we talked about, there are multiple types of evidence that medical affairs generates, including phase 3-4 studies, IITs, but also real-world evidence and advanced analytics typically sits within medical affairs organizations as well, and medical affairs has played a key role in adapting those advanced technologies. And then the part on the left is maybe the most innovative part of medical affairs, but really taking a view on the integrated evidence generation planning across the entire life cycle to inform the trade-offs in terms of what evidence to prioritize and to ensure that the evidence meets the needs of the patients. And this is a new role for medical affairs in many large pharma companies, and starting to see it come up across the industry as well. Integrated evidence generation means that medical affairs may own the evidence generation on the top right. May own the evidence generation during commercialization, but would influence it during early development and late stage development to, again, make sure that the package of evidence really supports the needs of all customers at launch. And then, as I talked about, advanced analytics is really just exploding, and a huge opportunity for medical affairs to play a role in leveraging the value of these data sets. Real world data is an incredibly broad set of data points, and moving beyond kind of typical randomized controlled trials, which you see in the red, to think about the broad set of data that's out there that can help influence decisions about treatments and ultimately improve treatment decision making is a huge opportunity for medical affairs. And then on the second component of the vision around access, typically medical affairs organizations have health economics and outcomes research organizations that are developing data about the value, the clinical and economic value of their assets. They also will often have field teams that are communicating this data to payers and other population-based decision makers. And then lastly, something that medical affairs leaders are talking about more and more is actually interacting directly with patients. So beyond the patient advocacy interactions that happen today, to think about how to make sure that individual patients as well have the information that they need to make the right decisions about their healthcare. There's a broadening of the access is interacting with beyond the traditional focus on payers to think about really these healthcare systems and others that are making population-based decisions. And with medical affairs as the role to contribute the evidence that they need to make informed decisions about the health of the patients that they cover. And the other big thing that's happening in access is a trend towards innovative payment models. And again, the role of medical affairs here is to really provide the data and information to support not only these contracts, but the monitoring of them over time as well. And it's another opportunity for medical affairs teams to step up and take on a larger role within the organization. Around transforming and personalizing medical engagement, as I mentioned, there are several different functions where medical affairs directly interacts with customers. The field medical teams, often called medical science liaisons, the medical information organization, which is typically call centers and websites and things like that, and then events and congresses, and also medical education programs. There's a huge opportunity for medical affairs organizations to really coordinate their engagement with stakeholders, whether it's patients or healthcare providers or payers, across all of these different channels, so that there's a uniform, high quality approach to customers, and they have a kind of similar experience across the different channels. And there's also a need for medical affairs organizations to really think about how they improve the interactions with customers on each individual interaction with customers, from detailed segmenting of medical stakeholders to really understand what they want and what they need for medical affairs, coordinating across channels, as I talked about, and then using digital tools to improve the engagement. Obviously, during the COVID period, we've seen a rapid uptake in digital tools for the field teams to interact with customers, but also there's opportunity to upgrade some of the digital tools that exist around medical information, medical education, and other ways that medical affairs reaches out to customers. And then lastly, the big thing to think about is how you measure impact. So you can make trade-offs, really inform trade-offs between different ways to interact with customers based and supported by data. And then the last one is around stepping up medical leadership. Having a very clear medical strategy that helps shape and define the future vision for not only medical affairs, but for the company overall, is increasingly a role for medical affairs. This will require a significant upgrade in talent and capabilities within medical affairs organizations, and a focus on the skills that they need to lead. And then as well, will require a focus on actually, as I mentioned, measuring the impact, but also managing performance to maximize that impact. So this is our view of the talent and capabilities required for medical affairs leaders. There's a need for the kind of business knowledge, strategic vision, and business acumen that lets medical affairs leaders become the leaders of within their own organization, but also cross-functional leaders across the company, and to really have provide effective medical affairs voice into those decisions to improve them. The adaptive leadership are kind of the skills that enable medical affairs leaders to interact effectively with other leaders, but also with external customers. This includes really understanding the needs of customers, where they're coming from, what they're looking for medical affairs, what are the struggles that they have within their own roles where medical affairs data and information could help. It also includes understanding the enterprise and really understanding not only drug development and commercialization, so function, finance, et cetera, functions outside of medical affairs, so that you can effectively feed in and help shape those decisions with a medical affairs voice. And then learning agility is a critical component for all medical affairs leaders, and really for many in pharma. As the industry continues to evolve rapidly, medical affairs personnel need the ability to learn and develop new skills over time. And the bottom set of capabilities are really role-based kind of technical skills. Many people think of scientific expertise. Being a physician is kind of the base requirement for the role, but all of these other skills need to be added on top of that. You clearly need a deep understanding of compliance, a deep understanding of the technical aspects of your role. And then the new one here is around digital and analytics, as that becomes increasingly important in all of our lives, being able to leverage the learnings from advanced analytics and large data sets, and also leverage digital tools to improve what you do. And then the other part I wanted to talk about was measuring unmet medical need, which is one of the first ways that medical affairs organizations are able to measure the impact of medical affairs today. Initially, we had little visibility into the true impact of activities, and one of the critical ones to know about is MSLs, given the resourcing of medical science liaisons. We could measure what they did, but not the impact of what it had. So companies are starting to look at EMR and claims data to look at changes in patient unmet medical needs over time and quantify the impact of an MSL visit on those activities. And the goal is, as we look forward, is to use the same kind of mindset to measure the impact of all medical affairs activities, and even eventually to measure the impact of activities outside of medical affairs on patient unmet needs or patient outcomes, so that we can make informed trade-offs between different activities to ensure that medical affairs delivers on that vision of improving patient outcomes and patient experiences. So thank you all. I'm happy to take questions during the chat as well. I hope that was helpful. And with that, I'll turn it over to Marie, who is going to introduce our panel.
Thank you, Anne. I appreciate that intro into medical affairs. And again, my name is Marie Sancherico, and I currently work with Takeda Pharmaceuticals and Health Outcomes. And I helped work on this program because I've worked in medical affairs now for almost 15 years. And When I first joined the industry, I didn't know what medical affairs was at all. I'm a PhD immunologist by training. I did all my immunology training here in Boston at Harvard Medical School, and I had never heard of medical affairs. And when I attend mass bio functions or I'm out and about, people will ask me what I do, and I end up spending more time explaining what medical affairs is than necessarily what my specific function is. And I've worked in, a variety of medical affairs roles over the years. So I'm very excited to have here with us today 3 leaders in medical affairs, and they have a tremendous range of experience between the 3 of them. We have with us John Prasic from J&J, who works on the device side and leads both clinical and medical affairs. And John wears a second hat where he also is president of MAPS, the Medical Affairs Professional Society, which I'm sure he'll speak a little to today. We also have with us Laura Saltonstall, who I've had the pleasure of working with in medical affairs at Sanofi Genzyme. And Laura is today with Alnylam Pharmaceuticals, leading medical affairs for both the US as well as Latin America. And then we have with us Greg Keenan as well, and Greg has tremendous early bio or early biotech experience, bringing to us preclinical type of experience, and he's SVP of Medical and Safety at AvroBio. So I'm so thrilled to have all of you with us, and I'm going to kick it off with I think an easier question, and that is, how did you end up working in medical affairs, and also something that what are you very excited about today? Maybe some of the differences or the shifts or what we're doing in medical today that is different than it was 15 years ago. And I'll start with Laura, why don't you jump in and start with this question?
Sure. So I had a similar experience to Marie. I started off on the path of being an OBGYN, pivoted to business school, came to Genzyme to do business development. Actually, that was around 15 years ago. I also had never heard of medical affairs. I was very familiar with sales reps in the hospital, talking about birth control pills in my field, but had no orientation to the medical side. And I ended up having different roles in different parts of the company and ended up working on an MS product that was phase 3 on the commercial team, but doing a lot of early medical thinking for the product. And so once we more formalized the medical affairs team, the new leader came in and said, I think you should be on the medical affairs side. And I'm still like, what's medical affairs? So that was maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And I really loved it and stayed in that domain ever since in a variety of different roles. And how have things changed? I think for me, one of the 2 big things I'm seeing are really the life cycle, the evidence generation planning starting as early as phase 2 on the medical side, particularly when it comes to how to optimize diagnosis in a disease state, putting together the evidence that you need for your particular product and disease area to support access, and the role that the team can play in patient identification and diagnosis. So things that just weren't touched on by Anne that I think, especially in rare disease where I'm working now, are critical roles for medical affairs as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. And absolutely, I think that Anne was starting to touch on the whole patient part, but yes, patient identification being absolutely huge. I don't see Greg on the screen. I don't know if others, but Greg, are you there? Maybe you can
I'm here.
Answer next.
You can see my screen. I've got my video on.
There we go. We can see you.
Great. Yeah, no, it's a pleasure to speak with everyone today. And again, my background, I'm a rheumatologist by training, med-peds rheumatologist. I did my training. I was in practice at Penn for a number of years. And how did I get into medical affairs? Well, long story made sure I was ready for a change. And one of the things just that was specific for my experience was there was this new thing called monoclonal antibodies that were being targeted towards immune-mediated diseases. And so it was just an exciting time to join and get into the mix to try to advance the science in the ways that Anne has indicated are possible. And relative to the point that was being made, medical affairs at the time was just being sort of built out from something that included just really medical information and field-based professionals, medical science liaisons going out to be able to understand what clinicians were thinking about. And over the course of the time I was at my first company is actually J&J, we really started to expand the scope of medical affairs to many of the things that Anne has been talking about with regard to engagement and strategy, getting involved much earlier. The traditional thinking was that you needed a medical affairs team probably no earlier than about 1 year prior to launch of any particular indication. I think now it's obvious that to be effective and impactful as a company, you have the kind of engagement the medical affairs can offer much earlier. What am I excited about with regard to today, especially now working for a small startup? It really, the thing I just mentioned with regard to getting involved earlier has become incredibly evident, trying to bring, in the case of what we're doing, gene therapy for monogenic disorders, trying to bring this new science to a community that knows that there's substantial unmet need, but the treatment approach is going to be a good deal different. There's a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done. All the things that Anne mentioned really come to bear, and they need to be brought to the fore much earlier. The final thing I'll emphasize is that then drives the need to be involved in strategy, because as you understand the challenges of the stakeholders out in the community, can bring that back in and really help inform how the development program will be organized, because it's anything but straightforward at the start. So medical affairs can be that key critical link between the external community and the internal development world.
Yeah, very good point around bringing insights back to the organization. And we might do it in a different way than somebody who's purely focused on development, right? It's a little bit of a different focus, having worked with, spending time with prescribers and not so much coming from a development, how do we get to a regulatory pathway perspective, but how are we actually going to get this on the market when it comes to market? And John, would you like to answer? I probably wouldn't have all three of you answer every question, but this one is particularly good for each of you to introduce yourselves.
No, absolutely. My pleasure. And thank you so much for the kind invitation to participate with this MassBio Forum on Medical Affairs. I think for the clear and probably the easiest way to describe my appeal and attraction of medical affairs is sort of an amalgamation of everything that I had done in my career. I began my career as a medical scientist, MD, PhD, dual curriculum, PhD in pharmacology and cancer biology. After my postdoc and internship, I then chose to pursue clinical specialty of neurosurgery and then even a complex spine fellowship. I was prepared for a career in academia, and I liked that dyad juxtaposition of doing research as well as clinical practice. I took a left turn at the end of fellowship and actually went into nonprofit Catholic healthcare, where I was a center director and program architect building multidisciplinary spine centers for Catholic healthcare and being able to run a clinical practice at the same time. Usually the studies have shown that once you're in practice, maybe about 10, 12 years, physicians get the itch. They want to do something different. 2015, I did my MBA, and as part of that, I reached out to what I thought was going to be 10 physicians that had made the transition. 11 months later, I had talked to 55 different physicians and scientists that made the transition. 8 of them were with J&J. Kind of the rest is history. As a surgeon, I came on to the medical device side of J&J, and I became the franchise medical director responsible for the innovation pipeline for one of their orthopedic platforms, DePuy Synthes Spine. It married what I was doing clinically, but also allowed me to really expand and have an unprecedented opportunity to grow my physician leadership career. That being said, the real appeal was I was able to expand my impact. They asked me during the interview, how many people did you treat that first year when you built your second spine center? I go, I knew the number exactly, 1,798. And they go, over a 24-hour period, you will treat or be responsible and have an impact over 1 billion lives. If anybody's ever seen the Jerry Maguire movie, where he had the line with Renee Zellweger. When they asked me why I joined J&J, they said, I go, you had me at $1 billion, so to speak, because that was just an unprecedented impact. Now, that being said, I like the integration of medical, clinical, technical, scientific. But I think overall, the thing that really excites me is what Ann has referenced. In the med tech sector, the ascension of medical affairs is even more exaggerated. We have new European medical device regulation where we are going from no evidence to now having to spool up to have evidence to enter the 90 countries that require the CE. That being said, I think that is really where we now transition from cross-functional stakeholder to fully integrated strategic business partner, as Ann mentioned. Marie?
That's a really nice segue to the next question. I think there's some legacy in medical affairs that it was started almost as a tool. Commercial would be like, oh, we need somebody who knows this, or we need somebody who knows that. We're talking 10 plus years ago, and it was more of a tactical function, right? Somebody would come to you with a question and you'd go answer it. And today that's so shifted. And I'm wondering if each of you could share an example of something that, where we're saying that medical affairs has become so much more strategic and a very important partner across the organization, maybe even linking development to commercialization. And, I think, Laura, I know you've launched a number of products, and I think that, that's a great, probably perspective on where the strategy comes in. Oh, you're muted, Laura.
Unmute myself.
There you go.
Yeah, so clearly I agree that everything we do needs to be within a strategic framework. And I am so impressed with the impact and the strategic input that medical affairs can have on, to also help commercial reimbursement, access, and clinical decision making around evidence gaps, et cetera. But I think in the context of launching projects, a few really strategic things is something we haven't talked about, but is really important. The role that medical can play early in KOL development, especially in rare diseases, sort of getting people activated around a disease and doing this in a strategic way. So we're thinking about diversity, geographic spread. This starts with, clinical trial sites and who you're selecting, and being able to think forward about who those key investigators should be and how that's going to impact patient care in the future. That's just one small example that I would offer, but this is where having medical affairs teams engaged early can make such a difference. Marie and I worked on a product where the pivotal trial, there were 3 sites in the US for an MS product in a big market, and it was such a miss because we joined after that, but there was no leadership, there was no enthusiasm or awareness of that in the US. So that's one example where probably certain people had short-term goals and weren't taking that full picture of the impact of patient care in mind early.
Right.
Just one example.
And you've made a few key points here, because I think we probably have quite a few people on the line that don't know what medical affairs is, or even what a field team. So when we talk about early, commercial teams cannot be out in the field and interacting until launch, until commercialization. And so when you have medical affairs teams, they're meeting scientifically and clinically with the community, and bringing insights and information back to the organization that's very helpful for data gaps and other reasons, as well as just building that relationship with institutions and healthcare providers. And they don't all have to even be investigators. I mean, we talked about this. We have a bit of a misrepresentation here because, we have a tremendous amount of PharmDs and nurses and PAs and other healthcare professionals that work on these teams that bring so much, so many different clinical vantage points. So I appreciate that, Laura. Maybe Greg, would you like to jump in now? I'm not going to keep going in circles, I promise.
Sure. No, I can just mention a few anecdotes of how you can learn things from engagement with the field, and especially if you think broadly on things. So I'll just mention that it's not just about meeting with quote tip-top key opinion leaders, so to speak, but understanding really healthcare as it's provided. So there can be external scientific experts, quote, of all different degrees and pedigrees, as Marie was maybe mentioning. I'll give you two examples that are interesting from the past. So one had to do with just how care is provided, drug benefit versus a medical benefit. So for instance, in the world in which I work, there were competing monoclonal antibodies, and some were given by injection and some by infusion. And the business model associated with how you deliver one versus the other was a good deal different, but it wasn't really evident to the organization as to how that would actually work in practice unless you went out and talked with clinicians about how they would approach bringing an infusion model or not. And then many times that influenced how they thought about things scientifically. Obviously, if you can't deliver a particular kind of treatment because you don't have the system to be able to provide it, you might think slightly differently about the evidence, as that was an intriguing insight. And then I'll just offer one from a more recent experience. This had to do with immuno-oncology agents. So immuno-oncology agents we're thinking of PD-1s, PD-L1s, for lung cancer and for other conditions. And the interesting thing there was because of the way in which those treatments work, it's not uncommon for the lesions to expand before they start to respond. It has to do with the way in which the immune system recognizes the tumor. And so who sees those or hears about those changes early on? Because a patient might be concerned that he or she is getting worse. Well, the person that many times hears about this first is actually the head of the infusion center. So the nurse that's managing the oncology infusion center. So the insights you could gain from those clinicians, nurses in this case, with regard to what happens in the early, I'm talking about first couple of weeks of treatment, the physicians had no idea what was going on because they were several steps away. So gaining insight from that group of practitioners very much allowed to be able to flesh out what was actually happening to the patients, and no one else knew it as well as them. So I'll just mention different stakeholders, you can gain different information. It's not just about, quote, tip-top opinion leaders.
Yeah, I completely agree. Just to build on that, one thing that I think is so important and strategic for medical affairs is really to understand the network at the institution, who are the key pharmacists, across all the stakeholders, the radiologists, the key scientists. And one thing medical affairs can really do is we've made this connections between the cardiologist and the neurologist so that they're talking and they're evaluating for the full spectrum of the disease. Where they're in the same institution, they don't know each other. And then you see alliances build and centers build. And this is a key strategic role that medical can play in both getting the right insights, but also, again, really advancing patient care.
Yeah.
I would just add that maybe a little bit different dimension from the medical affairs perspective in the med tech sector, which may actually be mirroring what's going on right now in the life sciences and bio, is that we're new. They're not used to having medical affairs within the company. The traditional model in medtech is you had your key opinion leaders that were the consultants. Therefore, your R&D teams that are developing the products and your commercial teams are used to that close relationship. They're actually a little bit threatened now that medical affairs is actually on board. So it's been very much a type of where we're having to show our value, but say, listen, we're not KOLs from the sense that you're looking at it. We're your internal opinion leaders. We're here to supercharge what you're doing to make sure that those interactions are even more powerful. But on the back end, you're able to distill out even greater insights with our interpretation. At first, like anything else, they're a little bit hesitant, but then they sort of warm up and realize, oh, well, can you do this? Like, no, can't sell from behind the white coat just because we're in the company now. So they're struggling to define it. And I think that's one of the things that maybe in the life sciences where they've not had medical affairs, there's some more analogies to what's going on in medtech. Now, the good part about that is that our role is a little bit different in medtech, is that we start at the very beginning of the product. We are actually the champions of what's known as the target product profile, or the blueprint for the product. And we take it all the way through the stage gate process, all the way through what we call life cycle, and then sunset it at the end. That sort of overall spectrum requires us to work closely. And you heard Marie say at the very beginning that I only not just do medical affairs. That's what I started at in 2016, but in 2018, our particular platform, we reorganized so that now you have preclinical research, clinical research, medical affairs, and sometimes we used to call it parentheses H, the H for health economics market access. It's a totality. It's a more holistic approach to what we're having to do. But on the device side, we're having to do it at breakneck pace. I like to maybe wrap up with just saying that what's the other thing that's really attractive is the fact that Marie said that I'm president of the Americas regions for the Medical Affairs Professional Society. It didn't exist until 2016, but now it's over 3,700 medical affairs professionals across the globe representing 200 different companies. The growth has been explosive because medical affairs ascension in that strategic pyramid that Anne demonstrated is really taking off at an exponential rate.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good point because we're talking about medical affairs today, but you know, our teams were so small back in the day, and it's completely grown and grown with very specific functions. I mean, Laura was touching on the fact that we think a lot about market access now and access for medications, and have medical affairs individuals dedicated to the payer space. That just really didn't exist years ago. If it existed, it was maybe with a large pharma. But it's been recognized now how important that is to have, a clinical person in there, and also from a data perspective and producing real world evidence. And I think I'm going to switch a question over to data now, and along the lines of, so we're generating new kinds of data, very different types of data. And one thing I'm thinking about a lot is we're starting to talk about generating even customer specific data and doing it in real time. And we're in the middle of learning how to do this. And so I think that's a very interesting concept and a very important aspect for medical affairs, because maybe we've generated data in the past and it takes several years and it's, for some clinical point. And now we're thinking about, okay, we have access to real data, data specific to the customer, and how can we deliver that so we have meaningful impact on how they're thinking about treating patients. So maybe each of you can point to, John, you already started touching on it, that you're from beginning to end, and in device it's iterative. How about how we're thinking about it in the biotech side of being able to real-time produce data and have, get that information out to whether it be payers, clinicians. Maybe I'll have let Greg jump in first this time.
Mm-hmm. I'll just offer a few things. I think that with regard to real world evidence and what we can garner from electronic medical records, I think we'd all agree there's still a substantial chasm from what we'd like relative to what we actually have. I'll just point that out. I had the opportunity at a previous company I worked for to actually do, I'm going to say, a time and space experience, because the interesting thing was we were trying to figure out how choices were being made in this instance, in this example, for the management of diabetes and hypertension. And I had the opportunity to work with a medical director at one of the major healthcare providers in California. And actually, he was a part-time leader and a part-time clinician. And we went through, he invited me in after hours, and we, in essence, went through an experience, a 15-minute encounter. We sort of role played, and I was the patient. And we actually walked through as if I was registered, and then walked through the office to every station I would go to, and then pretended as if I was the patient having a counter, and then was brought out of the office. In 15 minutes, there literally was a total of about 90 seconds where a clinical decision and a treatment choice was being made. And we were trying to understand, I was trying to understand what the clinician had at hand to be able to make that choice, and then what would be the elements that would inform that choice. The punchline, not that this is earth-shattering, was that there was a very short amount of time to be able to make a clinical decision, and then be able to assess whether or not the decision from before was one that had influenced things. It helped us, when we brought it back in, be better able to try to help portray for clinicians the things they ought to have objective-wise, what tools they had to be able to leverage, and where they could bring in a particular treatment strategy into the mix. I guess the point is real world experiences can very much inform how you think about bringing your drug to market and actually how you advance it and make it more useful to clinicians as you go forward.
Yeah, that's a nice point of bringing information back real time as well. I don't know if either, John, it looks like you're going to pop in there.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up from what Greg is saying is that we're entering a new phase where there's going to be a whole digital ecosystem overlaying our products. It's not going to be about the pillar device. It's going to be about the functional clinical outcome that product is going to, that whether it be a bio product, a pharmaceutical product, or a medical device. I think also it's going to have a phenomenal impact on innovation. What we're seeing with devices, it's going to be harder to enter Europe and the 90 countries that require the CE mark. There's going to be flooding of innovation to the shores of the United States. Our regulatory authorities wanted that, believe it or not. And the FDA, when they were having to answer to the Office of the Inspector General, which actually regulates the FDA, they said, we want more innovation within the shores of the US. So if you are an investigator, whether it be in devices, pharma, life sciences, bio, because of the way things are taking place, I think there's going to be a new focus on innovation, because now you're going to have new data sources, but more importantly, new insights. The flip side, if we look at our health systems and our integrated delivery networks, 5 years ago, at least here in the United States, they went through a massive expenditure to move into the electronic medical record. That cost billions. It was what they called meaningful use, and there was different phases of it. What's now is going to be the data dividend, because now there is deep repositories of information like we never had before. And that's going to be beneficial, and not only to patients, but also to all of us across the spectrum of designing products and therapies for those patients.
So we're really building infrastructure to figure out how to, I see Laura laughing at me.
No, it's true. And I think there's such an opportunity in the big data, but on the flip side, it's also overwhelming because there is so much opportunity. So this is where medical affairs needs to really prioritize their resources. And I think build tools and approaches, whether it's algorithms or red flags that someone can build in their EMR for automatic orders, or, for an echo that prompts the physician, so that not everyone needs to go and do that EMR chart review. So, we're taking learnings and getting them to that next step where they can be institutionalized, so that not everything has to be a research study. So that's something we spend a lot of time thinking about. How can we generate impactful data for sure, but also actionable that, can be reproduced. And I think, the other thing is thinking about the types of approaches to data generation. So we have a product launched soon after a competitor, people want to use them together. How do you generate that data quickly? Well, it's hard, but we can start by doing surveys and publishing on surveys. We can do retrospective analysis. We can do a prospective follow-up. We can look in our data sets even to see, were patients on a therapy, they stopped, they started ours. In our EAP, maybe they overlapped, and all the data cuts just to give a sense of the safety. But sometimes you can't, it's not all real time, because research does take time, and it can take longer than we all want to set up contracts and studies and IRBs. So sometimes, doing a survey and being able to make that data available, it's not as elegant as a real study, but it can give really be informative too. So, we're always struggling with how to do things that are actually very practical and actionable soon, I would say.
Right.
I'd like to build on what
oh, sorry, John,
go ahead. No, go ahead, Marie.
Oh, I was going to say that's a shift, right? I mean, years ago in medical affairs, we designed the study, we think about publishing it, and it was always this assumed to be this long process. And so we're shifting tremendously to having real-time insights to how do we make these actionable and still publish, but not always that being the end goal. Whereas years ago, we might have leaned more heavily that way.
Yeah. And another tool that's really helpful for that, if you're in a position to have a registry, because then you get so much real world data across different patient types. So as these things come up, you can start to answer in more real time based on the data collected. They're expensive, they're difficult, but it can really advance a disease state to have good solid registries. So,
especially in the U.S. where our system is so fragmented and you cannot follow the patient, it's so critical. John, you're trying to jump in.
I think we're maybe the glue that's holding the various silos together. Now, I heard Laura talk about, yes, registries, but there's investigator-initiated studies. There's scientific research collaborations, because so much is actually taking place in the academic world or in the ecosystems like we have here in Cambridge. But from the flip side, we also have a duty, and I have found in being in the position of sitting in front of the regulator and getting them comfortable with real-world data, particularly the notified bodies in Europe, where they're say, well, we now have these new requirements for evidence, but help us understand what you're thinking. And the refreshing aspect of it is that they're very open-minded and we're partnering with them. So I think this is an unprecedented opportunity as we're all learning together, both from those of us within industry as well as the regulators themselves.
All right, I'm gonna switch because I'd be remiss. I know Anne at the beginning mentioned COVID, and it'd be remiss not to bring up COVID and talk about the changes that are happening within medical affairs, whether it be how we're thinking about individual functions within medical affairs and talent or data generation. What are the impacts, immediate impacts you're seeing, and what might be some long-term changes that are coming about because of this macro world event that we're living through. And Greg, I haven't seen you on screen in a while, so I might throw it over to you.
Yeah, well, sure. I'll just mention, COVID related issues have, in essence, as everyone knows, shut down travel. So it used to be that the key thing was, especially for engaging with stakeholders, is to be there on their doorstep and be able to have, substantive conversation in an office, either before hours or after hours, when you really could have a deep scientific conversation. Now, none of that is happening, of course. I actually was incredibly pessimistic early on with regard to whether or not, quote, digital engagement could replace physical in-person engagement. In previous jobs, when I was oversighting large teams of medical science liaisons, I always looked at with a little bit of a jaundiced eye towards, quote, non-face-to-face engagements. I couldn't have been more incredibly wrong with regard to what we could accomplish with, Zoom-based meetings. In fact, I find that burnout is less on medical science liaisons, and ability to impact is greater, because now everyone's sort of wired up to carve out time to have video, not just phone call, but video conferences, one-on-ones, or actually small groups. And actually, I've thought it actually has enhanced our ability to engage, not lessened it. A couple examples, we'll have I'm working in the gene therapy area, and many times we'll set up an appointment to speak with, one particular person. And because it's a Zoom call, and because it's one where, people, have their schedules a little bit fluid, we'll end up having half a dozen different important stakeholders engage on the call just because they had time and it's not a big deal, and they could call in from different places. So I've actually thought that the whole COVID thing, it sounds crazy, is a magnifier with regard to our ability to really be impactful and engaging with field-based activities.
Yeah, I don't know if either of you want to comment on that or add something different that you've been observing.
I would say a couple things. So the initial impact of COVID that was the most troubling and difficult for us, other than COVID itself, was the impact it had on patient care, actually, sort of patient diagnosis, new patient diagnosis, and research studies. Many sites closed down, they weren't enrolling. We have some concerns around quality of life surveys in an era of COVID, and all the safety. So that's going to have impact, I think, over time for patients in the industry. So, but things are improving on all of those dimensions at the moment in the U.S. at least, and in most countries around the world, where patients are getting that access to healthcare and research back. But I completely agree with Greg. It's been amazing what we've been able to accomplish virtually. I think that it's really forced us all to innovate, whether it's virtual ad boards, different ways to provide education, using virtual data releases. And we've found that, I was at an advisory board recently where the doctors would not, this is all physicians, they would not stop talking. We didn't even have to ask questions. They were thinking, they're so lonely, they're so isolated. They just anticipated all of our questions. It was the most dynamic advisory board, but it just shows sort of what's possible. And I think that we may see less requirement for travel in the future. I think we're going to continue to really leverage these. And I have to say, for the advisory boards, there was a number of younger parents who say, I usually don't go to advisory boards because it means being away from my kids on the weekend. And, we're able to tap into this other demographic. I will say, I think it is harder to start new relationships with the same depth and trust maybe that you would. So you have to work extra hard, I think, at that outside of the Zoom meeting, how you maintain and deepen those, especially with stakeholders you haven't met before. So that's one thing we're continuing to think about, how you optimize that, where the face-to-face, it is hard to replace it in some ways, but we're all learning. So.
Right.
I would just add that we have now, at least in the device sector, that was cataclysmic because there was effectively the suspension of all elective surgeries for a period of time. Now that it's starting to come back and they are catching up, but they are still looking at what is going to be some of the long-term impacts. What we're seeing in devices is that there is going to be an out-migration of surgical cases from the traditional four walls of a hospital, which means the ambulatory surgery centers, the HOPDs or hospital outpatient departments will be the new venues because patients feel safe having their surgery. That also means that there's going to be triage, diagnostic selection criteria of who you can have the surgery there. But as manufacturers, we also have a problem and have to repivot ourselves because now we have to deal with an environment where maybe it's going to be single packs, maybe it's going to be disposables. There's going to be a variety of things that really have to play to the efficiencies of an ambulatory surgery center in those new locations. That being said, I think I would be remiss if I didn't talk about perhaps one of the casualties of COVID. And that is, I've had several clinicians call me and talk about, well, what is medical affairs like? What is their life after clinical practice? One of those was a practitioner that spent 40 days prone on a ventilator in an ICU. And he goes, I don't want to go back to clinical practice. Is there hope? Is my career over? And I'm like, absolutely not. There is an opportunity for you to start your new career, your non-clinical career, and to make the transition. So I think COVID is going to perhaps have a catalyst effect on medical affairs because there's going to be a new interest as people now thinking, well, what about what they're doing over there in pharma? What about what they're doing in life sciences? So I think we may have, there may be sort of the COVID class of 2020 entering medical affairs as a result.
Yeah. So some new talent, maybe it will help with talent recruitment because we definitely know in the Boston area that is a big challenge, and the remote world certainly might help with that as well. I'm going to move to the last question, and that is just around thinking about the reputation of the pharmaceutical industry, which has historically been low, right? And in medical affairs, we're often perceived as peers, right, to clinicians, and when we go out and represent companies, and so there is, Anne, I don't know if we mentioned this in the McKinsey article, but conversations come up that clinician leaders and having medical affairs, represent companies more and more will help with the perception of the pharmaceutical industry. And I'd love to know each of your thoughts, and if you're in conversations around this perception of medical affairs or perception of the pharmaceutical industry, and what role medical affairs is going to be playing, in the future. Often, I think it's been a little bit quieter, but I do see that it's becoming more and more important, whether it be questions of diversity in clinical trials or just so much leadership that's needed. So any comments that you have around that, and then we can let everybody grab their cup of coffee and get ready for their 9 o'clock.
Yeah, I'll just offer one thing. It's all about trust, and so I've always thought about it in this from the standpoint whether you talk with individuals or groups. Maybe they don't care for pharma, but they like their drug and the person they work with and so forth. They don't care for doctors, but they like their doctor. And so what I'd say is that it's very important to build trust. And we haven't talked too much about compliance. That's certainly for another day. But I will tell you that whether it's quote in field-based engagement in particular, you're judged based on the quality of the evidence and the conversation that you bring. And if it's trustworthy, it's objective. It certainly can have an angle, but if you provide sort of your perspective and try to make sure that the stakeholder with whom you're talking about is being dealt with fairly and objectively, boy, that's the kind of beginning to a great relationship. And I think that the quality of that encounter will be good, and the way in which the community thinks about what you have to offer from your company as a representative will go high. That's how we do it. But that's just stating the obvious. It's an important trust, and you don't want to violate that.
Yeah. I don't know, John or Laura, I can say.
I think overall, whereas maybe I'll pivot the question a little bit, is that particularly the new entrants to medical affairs are going to have to build trust, because this is new. We're coming in a new perspective. I think the future of medical affairs is going to be, if one can think of a compass, if you will, pharma is always going to be the North Star. I think medtech, life sciences may be at the southern point of the compass, but the other two domains of medical affairs that we may be working with would be the 3,500 medical affairs folks that are in our payers and insurers here in the United States, and then all of the medical affairs, the chief medical officers and vice president of medical affairs within the integrated delivery systems and health networks. Imagine we put the patient at the center of the compass, we turn our chairs inward, and now we create strategic advantage of what the future may be. Because those four domains of medical affairs that I just mentioned have not interacted in the past.
Yeah, and I mean, it's intention. I mean, Greg started to talk to it before, but really that, and I know Laura lives this since I've worked with her, but putting the patient at the center of all that we do and having the best intention and that for the patient, but as well as our customers in the field, really doing what's right. And there's so much of that having clinicians within medical affairs and bringing that voice of the physician and the patient back to the organization is so critical.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, we went right up until the hour, and I want to say thank you to all our panelists for taking the time, and thank you to the audience for spending your breakfast with us. And I hope everybody has a wonderful day. It's beautiful here in Massachusetts, so get outside for a walk and a break from your computers. And thank you, everyone, on behalf of MassBio and our team here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie.
Thank you.